Welcome, everyone, to the Sustainable Development Research Seminar hosted by the Higher Education Learning Community of the Greater Atlanta RCE. We're part of the UN's global network of regional centers of expertise on education of sustainable development. Today's speaker is Chris Cuomo, professor of philosophy and women's studies at the University of Georgia and an affiliate faculty member of the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program, the Institute for African American Studies, the Institute for Native American Studies, and UGA's Initiative for Climate and Society. She's currently editing the Oxford Handbook of Climate Justice Praxis with Sarah Keenahan. Her talk today is entitled Caring About Nature, Necessary Responses to Our Climate Crisis. Thank you, Chris.
Everyone. Thanks so much for coming. And it's the first week of classes for you. I think that we just finished up our second week, so it's such a busy time. So thanks for coming, and thank you for caring about climate change. So this is a paper that is going to be published in a philosophy journal called The Monist, which is not a journal in environmental philosophy. It's actually a very, should we say, mainstream, very prominent, kind of central mainstream journal that's doing a special issue on adaptation and ethics of caring. So it's a nice kind of intervention into the discipline, and but I'm still tweaking some things. And so I'm super excited. Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks, Stuart, for the invitation, because I know that y'all at Georgia Tech are kind of involved in kind of practical questions around sustainable development, including the development of technology. And I think that these issues are really crucial, but also they can be a particularly difficult and challenging sphere to integrate new ethics into, and caring about nature. So if those of you who are doing that work, so important, and love to hear about any of your thoughts about kind of the practical significance of these ideas. I'm going to kind of read and talk because, of course, the paper is too long for the whole. I want to leave time for discussion. And if there are any kind of philosophical issues, oh, that's beautiful. So nice. Around the questions about ethics that you're not familiar with, then I'm happy to kind of fill in the gaps there too in the discussion. Hi. So the climate crisis continues to grow, and we continue to devise strategies to shift the political will to embrace solutions that already exist, yet elude implementation because they seem to be too challenging to the status quo or to the powers that be. Such existing solutions include dramatically curtailing the use of fossil fuels, greatly reducing the proliferation of chemicals that contribute to climate change, and radically reducing deforestation, which are all totally possible, but disparaged and blocked by the industries, economies, and powerful people who profit from the status quo and trade on the popular appeal of denial. Hence, it's common for scholars and commentators to conclude that although climate solutions exist, the crisis continues to grow because there's a lack of political will to require or to voluntarily implement them. And that phrase, lack of political will, actually is from Barack Obama, who used it in the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, where he sort of said, I want to do the right thing, we do the right thing, but we don't have the political will sort of to back us up. The idea that popular political will is necessary to effectively address or solve the problem of climate change is taken for granted in a democratic society such as ours, but it's actually worth questioning whether that's a mistaken assumption. Energy policies, chemical industry protocols, technological development, and even cultural fashions generally develop from the top down rather than from the bottom up. Perhaps especially in capitalism, late capitalism. And the same can also be true of social values. So if you think about people getting their values from religious doctrines or something, like we kind of want to think of sort of moral development as grassroots, but it really is kind of top down, as you well know, technological development. Hence, citizens, even in a great democracy, may have little power to affect policies in relation to climate change. And correspondingly, the sort of political developments that could effectively mitigate against climate change might be effectively legislated without popular support. If the majority of lawmakers, be they democratic or authoritarian, were motivated by responsibilities to ensure long-term economic stability or responsibilities to protect ecosystems or to maintain a healthy environment or planet for present and future generations, other than values that are really about economic concerns. Okay, so you get the point that we're like we talk about political will. We don't really need that political will. In some ways, that's I think an obfuscation. But nonetheless, if climate change and the emergence of climate chaos is a preventable moral evil, and by that I don't mean something that evil demons bring about, or that evil human beings bring about, but by a moral evil, I just mean a preventable problem that will result in catastrophic moral harm. Okay, so genocide is an evil, whether or not it's carried out by evil people. So I don't care about, I don't believe in evil people. But there are moral evils are preventable and they result in great catastrophic harm. And so climate change, and that's comes out of philosophical work by Claudia Card, then climate change certainly counts as an evil. So therefore, it's important to strategize and work toward the cultivation of an effective sense of taking responsibility for addressing climate change, for reestablishing climate stability, and preventing total climate disaster. So even if political will is not necessary, it's still useful for us to cultivate a general sense of moral responsibility for climate change because, one, the problem exists and it's a moral problem. Two, climate change threatens everything that human beings value. Three, there is great widespread caring about the problem of climate change. So, and those who care are engaged in meaningful struggles to turn the tide against continued exacerbation of the problem at various levels, at the global level, the UN, at the local level, on campus, in corporations, in industries, et cetera, locales. And finally, of course, the future remains unwritten. And there's no way of knowing how effective responses to climate change may grow to be more influential. Certainly, there's no reason not to work toward the cultivation of greater and more effective ethical caring about the problem of climate change. And in fact, something that's really interesting and compelling about climate change is that it's a problem that any and every human being can care about and take on as an ethical priority. The planetary systems on which everyone depends for life, health, and thriving have been altered by pollution to a degree that has compromised the stability of those systems, which in turn threatens the health and the thriving of all life on Earth. At a given point in time, such as now, some may seem to be merely threatened by harm. Sitting in this room, right? We're not in LA right now. Like my friend who's, sort of evacuated. So we're like, yeah, climate change. Well, it's a little cold out there, but like, we're okay. But others, of course, are already experience and have experienced serious and lasting harms due to climate change, including, death and the, eradication of homelands, great loss of property, et cetera. So there is this difference that for some, it's sort of a real present problem. For some, it may seem only like sort of a threat. But nonetheless, we human beings share a position of existential vulnerability in relation to climate change, as well as a position of entitlement regarding the stability of the health of Earth's vital systems. No one owns Earth's atmosphere, and all living beings ultimately depend on the integrity of that atmosphere and relatively stable weather patterns. Everyone, therefore, might consider climate change a situation in which they or the world they care about or are responsible for are endangered. So with regard to climate change, there's an unusually universal we, denoting those who are entitled to regard it as a matter, ethical matter of personal responsibility. So we're also connected to climate change in an unusually universal way. Similarly, because all human beings live and depend on Earth, and therefore have a plethora of physical, companionable, spiritual, aesthetic, economic, and other relationships with the natural world, anyone might be motivated to protect nature and therefore regard climate change as an urgent matter of protecting what they care about, as well as protecting what they depend on, right? So there's the combination of self-interest and also protecting or caring about whatever one might care about, whether they be local and immediate or kind of distant and abstract. There's a universal we who can rightfully regard climate change as a matter in which we're harmed or potentially harmed through harms to nature. And therefore, as a problem we have a personal investment in solving, which is actually an awesome opportunity to build global and multicultural moral community. Has anyone here been to any of the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Conference? I feel like, did you feel like at the COP that there's sort of like that sense of like a community that like cares about something?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's tens of thousands of people there. And you're hard pressed to find anybody who would deny climate change.
And as somebody who works on climate change and, is obsessed, really cares about climate change, it's like in this gathering of thousands and thousands of people who also care and, who might have very little in common otherwise. It's very multicultural, international, multi-generational, politically diverse, et cetera. So that is really cool. That is really interesting. Okay, but as we well know, not everyone potentially impacted by climate change is practically invested in addressing or solving the problem. And in fact, some are heavily invested in denying or even exacerbating it. Hence, the cultivation of greater and more effective caring about climate change remains a worthwhile and compelling project as well as an urgent one. Now, what do I mean by caring about climate change? My conception of caring, well, there's a common sense that we all know what we mean when we talk about caring and caring about something that's, ethically important rather than caring about something that, is merely expedient or pleasurable or something. But there's a lot of work on caring in moral philosophy. And there is a lot of really great insight about moral caring and ethical caring that has emerged from the field of feminist ethics in particular. And as you might imagine, that comes from thinking about caring labor that is identified with the feminine or with maternal practices, with women's work, where women are trained to be good, girls and women are trained to be carers and actually become expert carers. And so so without denying that that is tied to oppression and an oppressive and coercive sexual division of labor, so we're not denying that, yet that still can create can create moral wisdom out of the practice. So so I'm kind of coming out of that literature in feminist ethics and that sort of whole tradition in feminist ethics. So there's a lot of serious thinking about caring, and we think about caring as emotional and or affective, right? So we think about sort of like caring, right, on an emotional level, but also epistemic and practical. That is, caring depends on, requires, deploys knowledge, and caring includes like caring for, that I'm talking about more than just the feeling of caring or the desire to care, so that there is some action, even if one is impotent and can't carry out one's caring, that one still, spreads the word, discusses it, tries to find ways to act on one's caring. Now, why is there an epistemic component? There has to be an epistemic component or knowledge, because you have to know what you care about. You have to be kind of pretty intimately acquainted with it in order to care appropriately and effectively, right? So think about someone who thinks that they care for you, but they have the wrong idea of like what you really need. That you need to know something about the thing in order, and that's why biological science is so important for thinking about environmental ethics, right? We need to know about other species, and we need to know about ecosystems and what they require to flourish in order to effectively care for them, because caring needs to be good for that which is cared for, right? It's not just sort of a moral act because one has the right attitude. So knowledge, my suggestion that caring about nature is crucial. Caring about nature, which again includes caring for nature, is crucial or even necessary for effectively addressing climate change, assumes that all moral agents have the capacity, if not the inclination, to care about nature in an emotionally resonant, informed, and active way. Now, to cut to the chase, where I'm going with the conclusion, I believe caring for nature in this way is necessary for effectively addressing climate change for two kind of general reasons that have a lot of kind of corollaries. First of all, without caring for nature itself, what do you mean by nature? So by nature, just take it for now to mean non-human beings, the more than human world, ecological integrity. I'm not excluding human beings from nature, but I am putting an emphasis on non-human nature because I'm contrasting this caring with humanism in a moment. So without caring for nature itself, human interests will outweigh practical concerns about nature. And decision makers will prioritize strategies of adaptation to degraded ecological conditions when it is difficult to protect those ecological conditions, rather than prioritizing policies that value the maintenance of ecological well-being. Okay, does that make sense, what I just said? Okay, and this has been in the literature in environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. This is the argument for something that we call environmental ethics, right? So we have all, histories of ethics. We have many ethical paradigms. I mean, like human beings, we know how to do ethics when it comes to other human beings. Not that we always do, but we know what that is, right? We've got sort of well-established ethical paradigms. Why are those paradigms insufficient for addressing and even conceiving of the moral problems that we're addressing when we're addressing environmental issues, ecological issues? Well, it's because those ethical systems are founded on the value of human beings, the fundamental and unique value of human beings, and accountability to other human beings, and equality of accountability and value among human beings. So those paradigms actually kind of require ethics to put human beings first. And so those paradigms are they're just insufficient. And this is not just a matter of selfishness. This is not just like, okay, we're humans and we like humans. Our sense of ethical responsibility to be accountable to other people will always prevail if we believe or assume that human beings are the only entities with moral value, and therefore the only entities to whom we're accountable. Accountability to nature as such, so what I'm arguing for, caring for nature, being accountable to nature, gives weight to the specific ethical concerns involved in climate change in a way that cannot be avoided by just thinking, okay, well, we'll migrate away from the problem, right? That landscape is going to be devastated and uninhabitable. Well, we'll have to move away, or there'll be kind of permanent drought, which is just called climate change in Australia, right? Deforestation, desertification. Therefore, we'll just move away. We'll find ways to move away or adapt. If those landscapes and ecosystems are seen as having a kind of moral value, then the fantasy of escape, the fantasy of migration is an inadequate response. Not that we might not want to include migration in part of our responses, but I think you see the point of me. Okay, secondly, humanism. And by that, I just mean a minimal moral respect for human beings. Okay, so lots of great critical work on humanism in political science, et cetera. There's a lot to say about humanism, but I'm just using a very basic general conception of humanism, valuing other people, valuing human beings as requiring, demanding moral respect. Humanism, even if it is a widespread value, and I'm not sure it is, but even if it is a widespread value, may not be a sufficiently robust ethical force to disrupt the psychological tendencies that are triggered in the face of disaster. So I'm going to say more about that and give you some data on that. But humanism, caring about other human beings, might be insufficient to mitigate against some psychological tendencies that we are learning about that are evoked when human beings face or learn about others that are facing disasters. Okay, so just to let me switch gears a little bit to talk about why this is so important for thinking about climate discourse, climate politics, climate ethics. Because there has been a shift. For those of us who've been working on climate change for a while, there was a shift around 2009, which is when the Copenhagen, the big COP happened. That was the COP that Obama was at. It was the first time that any funding, that adaptation was mentioned in the wasn't a treaty, but in the agreement. And it was also the first time that funds were committed for adaptation. Hillary Clinton famously dedicated $10 billion or something like that to, or, but then I don't know that ever kind of happened, but it was sort of like there was this shift in 2009 that was actually part of a larger shift. So talk a little bit about that shift and why I think it's important. We're at an important juncture where we need to think about course correcting in relation to that shift. And so I'm calling this the humanist turn. So the humanist turn in climate politics around 2009. I'm not arguing against the humanist turn, but I'm arguing for a course correction and a re-energizing of the project of cultivating care and respect for nature. So that it's like, it's almost as if we've kind of gone too far in putting humanism at the center of, or thinking of human concerns at the center of climate concerns. And I'm arguing for a course correction to kind of re-energize this thinking about the value of nature. So this is prompted in part by not just kind of my sense of where the movement is, where the politics are, where the discourse is, but also this is prompted by reviewing a massive amount of work in conservation psychology. So do we have any psychologists in the room? We're on campus? Do we have any psychologists on campus? Okay. So prompted by reviewing work in conservation psychology that argues that because people tend to report that it is their existing humanistic values that motivate their environmental involvement. Right? So in survey says, I'm involved in the environmental movement because I like to belong. I'm involved in the environmental movement because I want to be a good person. I want other people to see me as a good person. There's a lot of data on like when the Prius first came out, the driving of the Prius and people wanting to be seen as environmental. So getting a Prius because it's like, then you've got a great big, you're wearing a big suit on the highway that says, I care about what. But this conservation psychologists read these all as kind of humanistic values and argue that the data suggests, or the data shows, that trying to foster new values such as environmental values is a waste of time because we've already got the values that we need to address climate change. People are motivated by their humanistic values. Why try to get people to have these crazy new values like about caring about the environment when sort of we've got what we need, and that's what motivates people to change their behaviors. So, I mean, I think that the most kind of compelling argument against that position is that it's not working. So if the humanistic values are the things that people report are motivating them, then again, that motivation is insufficient to really to motivate mitigation. Right? So they might motivate adaptation and support for adaptation, but they're not motivating mitigation and political involvement to the extent that we need, and I think to the extent that we're capable. And of course, I don't buy it that people are not motivated by their caring for nature. I think that if you read the data a little bit more carefully, that some of what people describe as humanistic or like sort of wanting to be seen as a good person by who? by other environmentalists. Okay, well, why? So I think that there is a valuing of nature sort of embedded in what some psychological, conservation psychologists are describing as sort of merely humanistic. Okay. So in this humanistic turn, discussions of climate policy shifted toward thinking about social impacts and toward engagement with climate research in the social sciences. And, who could argue with that? I'm not arguing that that was a bad thing. And you might even, if you weren't around then or you weren't yet thinking about climate change, you might be surprised to even hear that like, did anybody ever like really need to argue that there are social impacts of climate change and that those are really important? But take my word for it, we did. It seemed to be stated between the lines. So this shift that happened, this humanistic turn, and sort of, I think was stating between the lines that, or hoping that our presumed bias to care for other human beings was going to be the magic sauce that like turned the political tide on climate change. So before the early 2000s, most academic work on climate change, work on climate politics, it all emphasized climate change impacts to non-human nature, to the non-human world. And then there was this shift. And it's like, oh, human impacts. And in 2010, when we created a faculty initiative on climate change on climate research at the University of Georgia, I was the only person who did social research, right? And it was like, oh, and then you can you can bring to the table, social impacts. And of course, now it's like, oh, think about, I mean, sort of it's obvious. And that was even after Katrina, so that's like kind of interesting. But we see it also in the literature. So let me say a little bit more to kind of convince you about this humanistic turn. In 2009, former World Bank economist Nicholas Stern published his treatise, The Global Deal, Climate Change and the Creation of a New Era of Progress and Prosperity. Advocating for capitalist solutions to the climate crisis, which he framed as a high-risk situation calling for ethically attuned public policy. So it's interesting to note that only 16 years ago, Stern, first of all, he mistakenly characterized climate change as gradual, incremental, and unintelligible. Right, that climate change was like just some abstraction out there. Like we needed to get serious about it, even though, it's sort of like long ways in the future. It's going to happen incrementally. And his descriptions of the challenges involved in motivating climate activism in wealthy nations are typical for that time. He wrote, "The first thing that struck me as an economist when I began looking at climate change was the magnitude of the risks and the potentially devastating effects on the lives of people across the world. We were gambling the planet. I was also keenly aware of the importance of direct experience in mobilizing action." Okay, here's the clincher. "Unless people have seen or felt a problem, it's difficult to persuade them that a response is necessary." Right? So that idea that like when it touches people, when it becomes real to them because they see other people suffering, then people will care. So note the view here that it's when people's own suffering or the suffering of those they relate to is experienced. When human suffering is on the table, the willingness to respond to this situation will just inevitably arise. So I see connections between this view and the view that people will care about climate change more and more effectively when motivated by self-care or humanism than when motivated about care for the natural world. But that's sort of like too heavy of a lift. Similarly, in a foreword to their 2009 anthology, Climate Change, Ethics, and Human Security, the editors wrote, climate change research needs a stronger social science voice and an integration of natural sciences to more effectively measure and motivate climate responses. They were highlighting as a new insight the idea that social crises will increase with climate change and that attention and research should broaden beyond looking primarily at impacts on natural systems. Arguing that the key causes of climate change are primarily social and the grave consequences of such change will also be social, they concluded, in these circumstances, we can no longer afford to talk only about the natural phenomena, but must also talk as urgently about human behaviors, human perceptions, values and rights, human responses and responsibilities. So up until that point, around 2009, the trend was to frame climate change through the lens of the natural sciences. But in the lead up to the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen, there were calls for more attention to the so-called human dimensions of climate change and a reframing of global warming as an issue of human security. But the idea that humanist priorities, be they self-serving or humanitarian, are the values with the power to just sort of automatically generate more effective caring and action to climate change has actually not come to fruition. Now, I do want to acknowledge that this humanist turn in geopolitical climate discourse was interwoven and commingled with, yet also distinct from, the development of a climate justice approach and a discourse of climate justice and attention to climate justice in global activism. And this is all exceptionally important. I'm not questioning the importance of any of this history. It's had a dramatic impact on research and climate policy, where we now find that the integration of interdisciplinarity, local indigenous knowledge, community collaborations, climate science for the people continues to grow exponentially. And activism fueled by climate justice priorities also continues to grow. But nonetheless, human-centered concerns have failed to spark the sort of widespread enthusiasm for mitigation. Right? Oh, wow, Bangladesh is going to be underwater. Let me turn down the heat, a little bit. Oh, weather's really changing here in Atlanta. I'm gonna, start composting instead of, putting things into the landfill, right? That actually does not seem to be, might be happening for us in this room, but like sort of like that, a widespread shift has not resulted from this turn toward humanist attention in climate science and discourse. By 2015, academic disciplines across the board were beginning to consider issues related to climate change and leading as fundamental, and leading environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club, adopted priorities and discourses emphasizing environmental justice and the human dimensions of climate change. The shift from mistakenly conceiving of climate change as a phenomena only or primarily impacting the natural world, as if that doesn't include humans, right? With the natural world presented as only incidentally including human communities, to conceiving climate change as a phenomena that harms, endangers, and impacts specific human communities and humanity in general is good, but insufficient. So what I'm suggesting here is some reflection and course correction. My concern is that assuming that ethical caring for other people is a deep lever that can automatically motivate caring about climate change. And that the most broadly accessible and effective way to help develop concern about climate change and behaviors that contribute to mitigation is through human-centered concerns. Or this idea that that's the best way, show people that humans are going to be concerned, and that's a deep lever that's going to result in their caring more about climate change. This is so, as I said at the beginning, because first of all, we can't assume that human beings have a robust concern for other human beings. So when we have ethics, they tend to be humanist, but I think that we could pull many examples out of today's news and tomorrow's news that show that humanism is not, especially at a distance, is not the motivator that we might sort of hope or assume that it is. It does for some, but not for many. But also focusing on harms and threats to human communities without also generating or inspiring caring about and for the natural world, earth, ecosystems, even caring about the atmosphere. Sort of an interesting philosophical challenge to articulate what that might mean, but I think it's very compelling. It might impel us, so focusing on human threats and without also caring for the natural world, as I also said at the beginning, may impel us to reduce climate action to adaptation, keeping human communities safe in the face of changes, disasters, and challenges produced by climate change and unlimited technological development. Human-centered concerns can be a route to care for developing caring for nature. Certain community is threatened because their landscape is threatened. Or so that might me sort of curious about and more inclined to care about learn about that landscape. Human concerns might lead us to learn more about our dependency, our interimbrication, the fact that we are part of nature. But to do that, nature must be visible in the equation. So that human nature connection has to be explicit. Just talking about humans alone won't get us there. Get us there. There's no guarantee that empathy for other people follows from learning about their suffering or vulnerability. And even awareness of our own vulnerabilities can trigger delusions and forms of denial that make us less likely to respond in ways that promote the common good and well-being of the natural world. So this is really interesting. So more work out of psychology and psychological studies about how people respond to disasters, kind of impelling disasters, immediate disasters, and potential or future or likely disasters. And we can kind of check our own psychological responses here. But when people learn about other people in disastrous situations, they tend to want to go into denial about their own vulnerability. And even more insidiously, and this is sort of, it's an embarrassment to human beings, but we tend to blame the victims in one way or another. They should have known. There have been wildfires in California for years. They should have known something could happen. Why are they even living there? Did they fireproof their home? And that's all. It's not. It's a kind of blame that seems to be rooted in the belief that I would be invulnerable, right? So these kind of, I think, sort of surprising, sort of sideways psychological responses to other people's suffering seem to be, and again, this is based on self-reporting and surveys, okay? I'm a philosopher, not a psychologist, so we could ask some things about the methods, but still, I think it's interesting data. That there's, I want to believe that we want to believe that we would use, whatever knowledge to make ourselves safe, to avoid a disaster. There's something called the sort of lurking belief in a just world. So there's a tendency for people to believe that bad things happen to people who somehow deserve it. Not necessarily because they're morally bad, but they didn't have sufficient foresight. Because we want to believe that if we are good, that the world will treat us justly. And the data also shows that if more strongly we identify with the victims, say through class, through culture, ethnicity, etc., the more we identify, the more we tend to blame them. Because through that identification, we want to believe, well, I would have done things differently, or I would have been able to keep myself safe. So this, I think, all indicates that we really just cannot deny, we can't rely on empathy to be that lever that compels us to care about climate change, because we care so much about those who are already impacted. Even the awareness of our own vulnerabilities can trigger delusions and forms of denial that make us less likely to respond in ways that promote the common good and well-being of the natural world. I put my phone away and that clock is wrong. So what have I got? 12:48. Okay. So like 12 minutes or something. Or around, I'll start to kind of move toward wrapping it up. So let me say some things about my suggestions for course correction. Obviously, my suggestion is that we need to kind of revisit or re-emphasize the project of cultivating, caring for nature as such on its own terms. Nature as such, nature on its own terms, does not exclude human beings. So the dualism and the dichotomy that either we're caring about humans or we're caring about nature is a false dichotomy. This whole section in the longer version of the paper about that's a false dichotomy. However, our ethical concern for other human beings, it has a different quality than our ethical concern or caring about nature. We don't identify with nature as completely as we identify with other human beings. There are differences. We don't communicate with nature the same way that we communicate with other human beings. Nature doesn't have the same interests that human beings have, it has other interests. It's not mobile in the same way. We can't think of, ecological communities, moving or migrating to stay healthy. I mean, there is some work on that, and relocating endangered species, of course, and, recreating novel environments so as to preserve them. But we can't do that wholesale. And also accountability to nature, that epistemic piece, knowing enough about nature to be able to care for it well, to be able to care for it appropriately, is a very different project than it is in humanistic ethics, right? We've got to, I don't know about you, but I was raised and continue to reside in a culture that has very little respect for nature and that does not encourage respect for nature. So many of us are not trained. It's not kind of built into our moral DNA in the way that respect for persons is woven in. And so for many of us, that respect for non-human entities, non-human collectives, for Earth, for nature, non-human nature, we need to think about it. We need to cultivate it. We need to work at it. It's a project. And so it's it's not necessarily a project that is opposed to or inconsistent with humanism, but it does have a different quality. So in arguing that, suggesting that we ought to recommit to the project of fostering caring for nature, I'm drawing from what I want to, or one way to characterize that I quite like, and I want to suggest and endorse is a kinship model. A kinship model with nature, caring about nature. And again, when I say nature, that's, it could be non-human individuals, species, collectives, ecosystems. So I don't necessarily mean, sort of nature as like sort of one big collective writ large, although that might also apply. But thinking of entities within nature, regarding those entities as kin. And that is a good way also to sort of like blend the humanistic and the sort of the non-human, the dimensions of caring for nature that are distinct from humanism. Kinship is, so you might have thought that I was going to say, interdependence. And kinship is not reducible to interdependence. Right? Your kin, you might just sort of like love because they're kin. You might have a sense of kinship just because entities they're nearby, they're around you. So I think that we could feel a sense of kin, and I know that this is going to feel counterintuitive, but a sense of kin, cultivating a sense of kin with those animals that we depend on for food. And that actually is the paradigm that many indigenous cultures use. Or the entities, the animals that the other human beings I care about depend on for kin, right? So members of the beaver clan in Anishinaabe communities, they're not allowed to kill beavers, but they protect the beaver so that everybody else in the community can enjoy the beaver meat and the beaver fur. Right? So kinship can have that sort of like fundamental protection that I'm not going to sort of incur on the rights, but it could also be a protection to preserve for wise use. So there's a lot to be said about this kinship model. The philosopher who's working on this, a Native American philosopher named Brian Burkhart, and he has a book called Indigenizing Relations with the Natural World. So he's working in the field of environmental ethics. He draws this kinship model from a vast literature in indigenous Native American philosophy. Very well-known figures like Black Elk, Vine Deloria. So it's actually really cool because he's drawing from his own Cherokee culture. He was raised, he's Cherokee, but was also raised in the Navajo Nation, but is drawing from kind of a pan-native literature in philosophy. And it's an idea of kinship that is very local. So it's not necessarily like, I am kin with all of nature. I mean, if somebody has that, that's great. So again, it's not an argument against that, but it's an idea of kinship with non-human nature as very local. What are the local species who I depend on? What are the local waterways? What are the species that, kind of bring me pleasure in my backyard? What are the species that have been hyper domesticated such that I can enjoy my organic milk, for $3.99 or something like that? But so very local. So asking, like, what am I actually kin with, because I am actually immediately connected to those species and beings in a local way. And that is aligned with how, back to that feminist model of caring, how interpersonal caring is cultivated in the immediate. The wisdom about the ethics of caring are developed, in the immediate. I want to suggest that we also do this in ways that highlight, well, that are multicultural. And if we are not Native American, I am not Native American. However, I am. So my argument is a multicultural argument. I'm arguing that, non-Native folks can, with the permission of the author, right, who put this work out into the world for all, I'm arguing that we can utilize the wisdom, learn from the wisdom of various cultures who have highly developed and well-articulated paradigms for describing, motivating, energizing, and living care for nature in local and immediate ways. And there are many, many such paradigms, and many of us who are ourselves multicultural people because of the societies that we live in, or because of our own ethnic backgrounds and our own multidimensional families, we probably have resources in our own worlds and our own traditions that exemplify and articulate this caring for nature in ways that we might not recognize if we're only thinking about kind of Western paradigms of ethics as humanist. The issue of locality and thinking about this in local terms also sidesteps one of the challenges in that feminists have written about in feminist care ethics, which is that it can be very difficult to care at a distance. So caring at a distance, like we might care at that emotional level. I mean, I tear up hearing the news all the time. We can care, but to make that caring effective can be very difficult. And if caring at a distance distracts from or takes energy away from our immediate caring responsibilities, then that's a conflict, and the immediate responsibilities will always should take precedence. So thinking about relationships with nature in this local sense and caring for local nature, I think is also interesting and important because it sidesteps that problem. So another thing that the psychological literature shows is that environmental behavior is not increased with eco-anxiety. So environmentally aware folk, right, who know a lot about environmental problems. I mean, I have days like this as well, right? That sort of, the more that you know, the less active you might become. And that's just about the nature of anxiety and disempowerment. And so we need elements in our moral life that are empowering and that are energizing and that remind us of the beauty and the value and the resonance and the importance of what we are struggling for. And I think that that's actually the magic sauce. That caring about nature can provide the magic sauce of sort of empowerment and feeding the soul that we ultimately, I think, really need to be good moral agents in this very complicated and scary world. So I'll end there for discussion. Thanks so much.